Hello, and welcome to episode 58 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Deborah Mayo, Professor Emerita in the Department of Philosophy at Virginia Tech. Deborah's research is primarily in the philosophy of statistics and consists of developing an account of experimental inference in science based upon statistical reasoning and the idea of learning from error. She is the author of Error and the Growth of Experimental Knowledge, which won the 1998 Lakatos Prize. She applies her approach towards solving key problems in philosophy of science, such as underdetermination, the role of novel evidence, Duhem's problem, and the nature of scientific progress. Deborah is also interested in applications to problems in risk analysis and risk controversies, and has co-edited the book Acceptable Evidence, Science and Values in Risk Management. In her most recent work, titled Statistical Inference as Severe Testing, How to Get Beyond the Statistical Wars, Deborah is motivated by the mounting failures of replication in social and biological sciences that have brought about a new urgency to critically appraising proposed reforms. Her book pulls back the cover on disagreements between experts charged with restoring integrity to science, and in doing so, applies philosophical tools to additional problems about science and pseudoscience, induction, and falsification. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Deborah. Dr. Deborah Mayo, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday afternoon?
I'm fine. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come on. It's a real pleasure to chat with you. How's your month of June been treating you?
How's the month?
Yeah. How are things been going?
Well, we began our seminar yesterday. It was pretty exciting because we got something like 25 people. We expected about 10 or 12. So there's a great deal of interest in philosophy, statistics, and current controversies in these areas. So, of course, I'm pretty busy.
Yeah, I see this new course for spring, the current debates in statistical inference and modeling.
Correct.
Great. So, yeah, what are the plans with this course?
Well, this is a course actually I have taught jointly, not this one, but something like it with Professor Spanos before. This is the first time we're using my new book. It's the first time anybody's using it. Mm-hmm. And in the summer, we plan to do a summer seminar for philosophy faculty, actually, a kind of in-depth, intensive 2-week program where you can come out ready to do philosophy of statistics, which does involve a combination of statistical skills and philosophical understanding. And without that, it's an obstacle to doing work in this area. So this is a different course from the summer seminar, but it is a kind of preparation.
Fantastic. Do you happen to know a fellow by the name of John Krushke? Krushke? K-R. He's a psychologist here in Indiana, but he's a huge Bayesian. And he finds his way in. He's written all the textbooks of Bayesian statistics, and I happen to have taken courses, advanced statistical courses in psychology with him. I don't know. He might be someone not a philosopher, but someone with sympathy toward philosophical issues related to these frequentists and Bayesian debates and or statistical inference debates.
He's a subjective Bayesian?
I actually don't know quite what that subjective Bayesian means, but he might be. He's very. He's very.
I'll send him a copy of the book. Actually.
Yeah, he's very He's thought a lot about these issues, and he just might be somebody to talk to. We can talk more later at some point. I know you'll be, and speaking of which, you'll be visiting Indiana soon. Is that right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
I'm looking forward to giving the Al Coppa lecture there.
Great. Well, all right. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of fun things happening with the course this term. And you had mentioned that you're teaching of this new book, which we will get to. But before we do that, why don't we take a step back, Deborah, and learn a little bit about your upbringing. So tell us, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Manhattan, in New York City, and I was interested in a number of different things, in art and in math and poetry and philosophy. My father always had a lot of philosophy books around because he was a minor in it, and he was a writer, even though he ultimately was a photographer.
Uh-huh.
And so I just got a love always of philosophy. So I wound up majoring in mathematics and philosophy, and really didn't have the idea that I was going to do philosophy of science, certainly not philosophy of statistics, until I got to graduate school at University of Pennsylvania.
Where did you do undergrad?
Clark University, up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and so I was a math major, and there was really wonderful opportunities. I was able to teach there even while I was an undergraduate. Logic was my thing, and it was for many years, and still is. I mean, I taught logic most of the time. And I was going to pursue graduate work at Berkeley in mathematical logic, and in the end, I decided to go to University of Pennsylvania. I mean, going to California was too far away. My father was ill at the time, and I just decided to go there, and I wanted to keep up my mathematics so I wouldn't forget it, and so I was just looking for some math course to take, and I saw that the math department was far, far away from the philosophy building. I still always tell this to people when I go there. Whereas something called statistics was very close. It was in the Wharton School, very close by the philosophy department. And they were also offering a course in probability, which I was thinking of doing. I'd never taken. I'd always taken pure math type of course. So that's how it happened that I walked into my first statistics class. And
yeah. Tell us about this. What was that first class like?
I fell in love with it. Well, back in philosophy, especially philosophy of science, everybody was talking about the problem of induction and confirmation theory and trying to build and improve on Carnapian accounts of confirmation. And obviously probability was important. But once I walked into that stat class and saw how they do things, I realized that there were answers here to the problems that philosophers were worrying about, even though other philosophers also realized that. And in fact, the whole field of what I would call philosophy of statistics was very active back in the 80s with, Ian Hacking's book in 1965 and Isaac Levi and Seidenfeld and Gehry and Keiberg and Fetzer and lots of people. So it was quite interesting in a way that philosophy of science was very much ahead of its time when it came to statistics, because this work was undertaken both by statisticians and philosophers, even back then, even before we sort of committed to become relevant to practice.
Yeah. So what were the main questions in the 80s relevant?
Well, first, we were still hoping to justify induction. By the way, in my book, I do claim I say how to solve the problem of induction now, whatever. So that was a problem. But building these formal logics that could avoid various counterexamples. I mean, Carnap showed it turned out there were too many systems, and we'd have to introduce various requirements, which were at most based on inductive intuition, as he called it, for which system to choose. and they never got very far with respect to languages. Another big problem was, could you come up with a formal language that would capture scientific claims that you could then run through this formal logic? I mean, the hope was you could give the data to the philosophers or to the philosophical system and the hypothesis, and it would tell you how well confirmed it was.
Right.
Which seems sort of amazingly ambitious.
That would have been great.
Carnap's plan. And so it was the Carnap-Popper that, disputes and all of that was really big. So I started to change, started to shift interest. I was definitely going to pursue the logic. The logic professor was Brian Chellis. He left that year. We got a great logician after that, Scott Weinstein. But by then I was already moving toward this statistical stuff. And I thought it wasn't really that big a leap at the time. You're doing logic, you're doing logical systems, and so statistics is mathematical and logical, so it wouldn't be that big a difference, but it's really a huge difference. So that's how I got into the field.
And so in terms of questions related to philosophy of statistics, you mentioned some of the other ones related to induction and logic of things, but what about statistics? What were some of the issues and debates around then? Right.
Well, a huge issue, it's still with us, is Bayes frequency, Bayes frequentist wars, as they call them. But, of course, we have many more types of Bayesians now and more types of frequentists. In a nutshell, the frequentist has systems of inference usually justified by their long-run probabilities of avoiding errors. So their magic was, regardless of the true hypothesis, they could give you a rule of inference that would rarely be wrong. And so this is a kind of performance attribute. The Bayesians sought methods that would use probability to capture degrees of belief, confirmation, support, and therefore seemed more connected to epistemology. So philosophers naturally gravitated to the Bayesian account. And yet there were others who were frequentists, Kuyberg and Geary and many others. And so that was one of the very big debates. And still with us. And then even specific debates about the nature of significance tests and how to interpret them. With Bayesianism, of course, this is the natural outgrowth of the confirmation theory that people like Carnap were doing. So in other words, there's a kind of parallel that Carnap is to Bayesianism as Popper is to frequentism. So that's why there was this great interaction between the philosophy of science and philosophy of statistics. And of course, these people were aware of it. They were also intermingled. And if you look at Neyman and Pearson, a major founder of frequentist methods, he was actually talking to Carnap. And other people, Hinsica too. They were interdeveloping their work. So it's quite fascinating.
So as a budding philosophy of science student, graduate student at Penn, how did you enter the field? How did you, what were some of the first, your means and methods of ways of tackling some of these problems? What could a philosopher of science like yourself do? You mean,
still as a grad student or after that?
You could trace from grad student to kind of early career, but if those are connected. But I guess I'm curious of sort of like your first attempts, your first forays into these problems, and trying to figure out what you can contribute as far as your research.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, again, I felt that what I was learning, what I was understanding from statistical methods really would give a way to solve these philosophical problems about induction. And, of course, the problem of induction is how do you justify going from observed cases to generalizations to unobserved cases and so on without just in a circular way saying, well, this kind of method has worked in the past. And it seemed to me that the sort of models and methods being used in statistics really gave one the key. And what's fascinating, by the way, is years later when I was talking to Wesley Salmon at Pittsburgh, and that was in 1989, and we were talking about how to test the assumptions of statistical models, because the big block that the logical confirmation theorists felt is we can't really test those models, and they're looking for something foundational. They're looking, to start from the base foundation. So they never wanted to start assuming, let's say, a coin-tossing model because they thought that would be circular. But what Wes Salmon and I were talking about is testing these assumptions, and what he said to me in '89 is, I think that we were too quick in rejecting the idea that we could test them, because there are tests of assumptions that are not circular, and that they might have actually rephrased the entire problem of induction back when, knowing these methods. So anyway, I guess I felt I had something to say about how to solve a lot of these problems. But that was a little narrow until I came to Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
I wasn't really sure if I was going to stay in philosophy, and I was sort of inclined to go to... Sorry?
Oh, no, I'm just inquiring. Yeah, so what was your thought process at the time?
What was my... No, I was inclined to go into mathematics or statistics.
Right. I know you mentioned you were a math major and philosophy, and so...
Yeah, and math. I was going to do math, and I love math, and philosophy, really fascinated me, but I really didn't know how it was going to work out. And and so it was really very accidental that I interviewed. This was the first job I interviewed for. I hadn't even begun my dissertation. I don't know if I could reveal that after all these years. I was just in my third year. We didn't used to spend a lot of time. Now grad students take often 5 years as a routine. And so I went for this interview and sort of talked up this dissertation and got a campus interview and got the job and just took it. And never expected to stay. Being a city girl and all that. And this is
right. I know folks who grew up in Manhattan. It's hard to leave. It's hard to see any other kind of life. I have family from New York, so I hear it all the time. They're like, "Why would you want to live anywhere else?"
Well, I'll tell you, I do have the luxury now. We have a place in New York City, so I can spend time in both places. But basically, I just thought it was exciting. I was single. It seemed like a lot more money than grad students were getting. And I wasn't thinking in terms of, I think I should have probably been advised differently, but I was advised, go take it, it'll be fun, you'll go over there for a couple of years or something like that. And I wound up staying, about a year after that, I met my husband in New York, and I also had an NEH the following year, so I had 2 years off after only having been in the field for a year. One was a personal leave to decide what to do, really, and the other was this NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, so it was fantastic. And I did teach a little bit up in New York at Stony Brook because we were living out in the Hamptons and Long Island. So I was going to stay there, but lots of interesting things were suddenly happening in philosophy here. We had a dean who really wanted to promote philosophy of science and interdisciplinary work in science and technology studies, and he put a lot of money behind it. Larry Loudon, who was the well-known philosopher of science, came was brought in, Dick Burien, and he was also given, a lot of money to start this program. And we had visitors, Alan Musgrave. So it was so exciting what was going on here. I couldn't resist not coming back. So just when I was making up my mind as to stay in New York, I said, let's go back to Virginia for a few years and see what's going on.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting, though, is that Larry Loudon really challenged me and said, well, what's the relevance of the stuff that you do in philosophy of statistics? This is like this arcane stuff, and we're interested in theory appraisal and theory change and the whole Kuhnian, thing, paradigm change, and how do we decide which methods and rules to change, and problems of determining how to falsify Duhemian problems and all that. And so it was, once I looked at these general philosophy science problems that I hadn't really looked at so much as a grad student, I realized that this work could be quite relevant to that, too. So that opened up this whole sea of applications for the basic ideas I was developing in statistics. And so I had this idea, I said, I have this one book in me, and that one book became Error and the Growth of Experimental Knowledge.
Right.
Essentially applying these statistical ideas to general philosophy of science questions.
Really?
Kind of questions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about...
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Paradigm change. And so I really, in the preface, you can read about this in Error and the Growth, about how his challenges really got me to open my eyes to see how to apply all of these ideas. And I call it, a work in the new experimentalism, the idea that philosophers of science had, that really philosophers weren't paying enough attention to how we actually get data. The whole idea of the logical positivists, you sort of start with data as given, big mistake. And, of course, Popper and Kuhn challenged this, didn't have answers to how do you justify the data, the collection, modeling of data. So there were a group of people, I guess, Cartwright, Hacking, these are some of the names, Gallison, working in what I call the new experimentalism. And that was very, very promising in philosophy of science. So that's what that work is in. It also has philosophy of statistics in it, but it's primarily relating to problems that philosophers have. And that's why this current work of mine is so different, that for the first time, I'm actually starting with the problems that actually face practitioners. The fact that grappling with those problems also brings me to solutions to philosophical problems is a great example of this two-way street that we have. But basically, I start from the foundational and philosophical, conceptual, logical problems that are causing such difficulty today in the field of statistics and data science, as the new term that people like.
Yeah, well, let's start talking about that. So how did you come about? So you mentioned this very stark contrast from your first book to this now, well, the book in '96, Error and Growth of Experimental Knowledge, to your most recent book, Statistical Inference as Severe Testing. So how did this transition come about from working on problems in this other way to finding problems, as you mentioned, in the science or in the statistics?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think I was always immersed in both, but gradually became very obvious, first of all, that philosophers of science were not as immersed as I think they should be in the actual problems of practice. And yet the problems of practice were so philosophical and so conceptual that I really felt and still feel that they're really missing out on a great, area where they should contribute.
So what were some of those problems. Just so you know, there is always like the emphasis. We need to focus on the practice. But what are some of these? If we turn to the practice and we see this, these rich philosophical problems, what kinds of problems are you referring to?
Well, one of the really big things have to do with justifying the methods. And guess what? The same Bayesian frequentist disputes are really behind them. But what seemed to happen over the years as we got highly powerful computer methods, that people were applying statistics in a very unthinking way. You wouldn't really have to learn how to do these things by hand. You would just press a button and so on. And so people were increasingly, I guess you might say, definitely 1990s, 2000, people were coming up with all kinds of exciting findings that would not replicate, and we have this replication problem when others tried to replicate them using better protocols and pre-registering hypotheses and so on. And it wasn't just psychology and the social sciences. Once it really started to spread to other fields like genomics and medicine and bioinformatics and all these new fields that were coming up and that were so data-rich, right? Then people started to take them seriously. And some of the reforms that were being put forward, were very controversial. And so I think it's the combination of the big data and the computerized methods and the fact that people were less likely to be trained in statistics officially, like you might be a biologist and take the new genomics methods as just another tool, not realizing all the treacherousness once you get into statistics about bias, about even developing your microarray in one lab versus another. It turns out that there are so many huge differences in the different labs that it would swamp out any interesting or existing scientific effect. And people didn't know that. So they feel that we've lost 10 or 15 or more years of the whole genomics revolution, since they started to work on that, which is really too bad. So it really has to do with these statistical issues, data quality issues, and so on. And I don't know if you read about these things, but over the last 10 years, you keep hearing about, is science broken? Whatever happened to the self-correcting features of science? They used to be self-correcting. And, of course, what we see is there's a lot of hucksterism that comes out of that. People who diagnose things in the completely wrong way and give recommendations that are wrong-headed. And so I really couldn't resist. I mean, I really feel there's a responsibility. This is our job as philosophers of science to help solve some of the sicknesses and illnesses of conceptual and foundational sort. Just to give one example, by the way, I guess it was 2015, the American Statistical Association decided that there was enough controversy about the use of a method of statistical significance test, which is supposed to distinguish chance variability and spurious effects from genuine ones. There was enough controversy that they would get a whole bunch of statisticians together and give rulings and principles on how to use this. It wasn't as simple as that. There were a lot of pushes from the sides that wanted more Bayesian methods or that wanted confidence intervals as opposed to significance tests. There were also at the same time many people worried about how data science was usurping statistics. This might not be a topic of interest for this audience, but for statisticians, it seemed like their whole field was disappearing. And it actually turned out to be that way. Almost all stat departments have either combined their names, statistics and data science and so on. And the reason it was scary and still scary for them is that people were getting data science degrees without actually getting statistics degrees. You didn't need that. It was really something to work in business, to work in artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on.
That's an interesting shift, disciplinary shift in terms of what is
really
required
is.
for you. Yeah.
It's very much still a big issue. But in 2015, when the American Statistical Association decided to do this, it was both reasons. It was feeling, we're behind the times. We need to do something. And anyway, I do know the director a little bit, the executive director from the ASA, American Statistical Association, and he followed my blog. I neglected to mention that sometime back in about 2011, I started this blog, and a lot of the components for this book began their life there. And he said, well, you ought to come to this and be our philosophical observer. I didn't know really what that status was, whether I was supposed to say anything.
Philosophical observer. Am I just what is that?
Exactly. I mean, I just went. It was a few days before the conference. I said, fine. And because he was saying this is going to be historically significant. Well, anyway, so it seemed to me that a lot of their problems, a lot of the confusion, the ability even to articulate what the different goals were really conceptual problems about testing. What do we mean by inference? What are the assumptions? And I thought, boy, I shouldn't be the only philosopher here.
Yeah.
Let me go back a little, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Because it reminds me of something I forgot, that I was quite interested in running conferences and so on. I had done an NEH summer seminar back in 1999, and I started to really put together workshops and so on. And during the crash, the market crash, my husband is an investor. He really wanted me to get into the stock market. And so this isn't the best time to get into it, but it was during the crash that actually I was immersed in it. And we did do very well in surviving that and buying up things that were just a few dollars and so on. So I put together money, and we started this fund, ERA, focused on experimental reasoning, reliability, objectivity, and rationality of science. First thing, and one of the conferences was connecting to I'm sorry about that noise. Student of Eric Lehman.
Mm-hmm.
Eric Lehman, being a student of Neyman. And I was putting together a session on philosophy of statistics and had this wild idea that I would invite Sir David Cox, who's probably the most famous statistician in the world. He recently got an international prize in statistics, to this conference that was going to be in Texas, and he's at Oxford. And this was in 2003. And I invited him, and he said, yes, so come.
Wow.
So here's how I began doing work with this most famous, world-famous statistician.
Yeah.
Because we did this session together at this conference for Eric Lehman. And then when we were putting together our papers for a volume, he said, I think, our paper would be interesting if we put our papers together and do this thing. And he was actually always interested in philosophy and philosophy of statistics, and knew Fisher and knew Birnbaum. These are other names of famous statisticians who are also involved in central developments and debates in statistics. And so this was a great thing. So we wrote that paper, and then I did a conference called ERA 06 in 2006, and Sir David Cox actually came here for it. We had all kinds of sessions. It went on for 4 days. We had graduate students. So this fund that I had developed was used, for part of that, and continuing on after that, a conference in 2010 at the London School of Economics. I began to be a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Also, I was always visiting there, and eventually. So, and I'm still a visiting professor there, and so I like to run some conferences there. In 1998, I got the Era and the Growth book, got the Lakatos Prize, and that prize is given by the London School of Economics. So that was another big connection with the London School of Economics.
That's quite a big award.
Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with. Yeah, no, I believe I've spoken with someone recently who may have been awarded this, the award. But no, that's a very esteemed research prize.
So I just realized I'm saying some of these things out of order, but my connection with London School of Economics and with Sir David Cox was very important in my development in the 2000s in this area.
Yeah, I in looking at some of your work, actually, there's a published conversation between you and Sir David Cox. A statistical scientist meets a philosopher of science, a conversation between Sir David Cox and Deborah Mayo, as recorded. This is in 2011. Which I think is wonderful. I actually wish we did a little bit of more of this kind of particular publications of these conversations.
Yes, I would love to do that. And here's the really hysterically funny thing about that is I was to interview him, and I had a tape recorder, and we were in England and everything. And I guess he didn't like how I was doing it, or it wasn't going that well, Interviewing is kind of a skill. And he said, look, let me show you. So he began to interview me, like, Professor Mayo, so what is your feeling about Bayesian inference and the new non-subjective Bayesian? And so you'll notice, if I included that there, that he's actually asking me questions.
Yeah, it begins with him starting off.
Strange.
Yeah. He's like, I'm sure he's probably had enough opportunities to chat. Yeah, why not do something? That's pretty funny.
He was better interview. So it was a little bit of a game, and I was sort of surprised that he went along with it.
No, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Great.
And I'm still in touch with him. This man is 94.
Wow. Is he? Where was he? Was he at the LSE or was he?
No, he's at Oxford.
He's at Oxford.
And has been there for a long time. And a most recent thing was that my new book, Statistical Inference of Severe Testing, made its first appearance at a Royal Statistical Society meeting at Cardiff on September 3rd. And it was a session that I put together that included Sir David Cox.
Wow.
And it was very surprising that we were doing this all together because, you see, Sir David Cox has written about significance testing since the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and really is quite troubled with some of the debates coming up recently with some journals banning p-values and just misinterpreting the test, going back to some of the foibles and fallibilities that he, for one, corrected, years ago. And he didn't really want to weigh in on these things in the last few years. And finally, I think he got convinced that maybe he should. Because I had said, well, there's this session that's going to be going on. And he said, no way, I'm not going to. And then one day he said, well, maybe I could talk about the history a little bit in this short period. And I said, are you serious? And I had already fixed the session, but I asked them if they would extend our time in order to include him. And, of course, they were thrilled to have him. So it turns out that in early September of 2018, I was in a session with David Cox, also with my colleague Eris Spanos and Professor Morey from Cardiff, and my book was rushed to be there. It wasn't even a version that was quite ready. I don't know, afterwards it took them a few weeks to come up with more, but they had them for that one time, and it was great fun.
That sounds...
Okay. Yeah, and here we are.
No, it's wonderful. I mean, it's amazing to see some of these, particular research colleagues, especially. I mean, this story traces for over the past 20 years, practically, of having developed, this work, and that's really something. So now there's been, there's a number of works. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we do have your new book, Statistical Inference as Severe Testing, how to get beyond the statistical wars. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the main, I suppose we could start with maybe some of the main, controversies or debates with which this book seeks to address, to wade into, and then, how it goes about offering, particular either positions or solutions to these particular issues or problems.
Yes, well, I undertook to present these issues in a very different way, because these wars about Bayes frequent tests and about significance tests and all of that are so contentious that many people want to feel that we're really beyond all that. And people always start out by saying, we're not going to rehash the old Bayes frequentist wars, because for one thing, we're beyond them. We now have these sort of reconciliations and unifications where we don't use subjective probability, we use a kind of non-subjective or default prior, which makes the data the most dominant thing, so we're not bringing in our background beliefs, and everybody's happy. And yet we still have these two approaches that use probability in fundamentally different ways. But a big problem for frequentists have always been, what is the relevance of their long-run error probabilities? They have methods that can guarantee, I mentioned earlier, that the interpretation of data will rarely be wrong in some series of applications. Well, what about the data in front of us now? Mm-hmm. And so the motive for these unifications really was from both sides. The subjective Bayesians didn't want to be so subjective. Mm-hmm. They wanted to have some kind of frequentist guarantees. And the frequentists wanted to have a way to connect their frequencies, their error probabilities of methods, to something that was more inferential and epistemic, even though it wasn't clear how they were going to accomplish that. But the truth is that these disagreements are really underlying a lot of today's debates about scientific integrity and the problems of irreproducibility and questionable research practice. And this kind of fear of reopening old wounds actually has allowed them just to fester. And so I start out saying that we're going to go back. We really need to reopen these disputes, but we're going to do that from a kind of meta level. We're going to go back to the museums and look at what the founders have said, and going to try to present a view that will at least allow you to understand the debates. And we really start from the problem of today's brouhaha and the lack of replication and the challenges that say science is broken because it's not replicating, it's not self-correcting. And the fundamental problem is that it's become much too easy to get findings that are spurious because we have these high-powered methods that will dredge the data. So I come up with a very simple idea to get us started. And this very simple idea is that we don't have good evidence for a claim if nothing has been done to rule out the way that claim can be wrong. before we can say that we have evidence for a claim, something must have been done, hopefully a lot, that would have shown up a problem in that claim. This has echoes of a Popperian kind of idea, right? It definitely does. It's just that Popper never worked it out. And the reason he didn't, I say, is that he didn't use statistics. He didn't have statistics. I actually got a letter from Popper which said, I always regretted not learning more or not having more statistics. Seriously. And I thought, gee, not as much as I regret it, because I think he could have used it to get his corroboration idea off the ground, because he wanted to be able to say that we have a good or severe test of a claim insofar as the claim has been put to a test that probably would have found it false if it is. But he was unable to ever say that we have severe tests, that we have anything like a reliable method to probe flaws, because that would seem to involve induction, which he was trying to avoid, and keep it all deductive. And it does involve induction. It's just not induction by the classic enumeration. So I start with this principle, this minimal principle for evidence. Something must be done, right? And it holds not just for testing, really, for any claim. It can be exploration, prediction, estimation, and so on. And using this simple tool, I claim, we can at least uncover what the wars are about, because what you discover is some of the reforms being put forward by the experts don't satisfy this severity idea and are even in tension with them. So I go through all of the leading debates and controversies using this tool.
So what's underneath these big debates?
What's underneath?
Yeah. Or, well, you pull back the cover on the disagreements between the experts. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, there is this basic difference in idea about the use of probability and the nature of inference. And what I provide is a new way to use this long-run error probability idea, this long-run performance idea, for interpreting particular results. If you think about what all the hand-wringing, right, that I'm saying, is people who go out and data dredge. They try and try again until they get something that is impressive looking. They look through subgroups, if it's like a clinical trial, until they find one where we see some impressive difference, right? And so all the hand-wringing is that it becomes very easy to find spurious effects. And so we have this principle that says we should block those. But when we criticize somebody for p-hacking, as it's sometimes called, keep going until you get something significant.
Right.
It's not because we think that person will be wrong in the long run very often. It's not because we say, the person who data dredged is using an unreliable method, even though it's true. Rather, we say they have done a poor job in testing in this case. They didn't do a good job. They didn't bend over backwards, I say, to show that they were really putting their claims to the test. And I say that this is how humans reason. And it is not a notion that you will find in any statistical account, which I find kind of perplexing. So it's a third use of probability that is different from my representing beliefs or confirmation, which I call probabilism. And it's different from merely saying we control our errors in the long run, as if that's all we can say. And by introducing this, I think this third way, then we go back to all of the debates and we get completely different answers, but at the same time we understand why the competing tribes are talking past each other. So,
yeah. So if we
take a look, yeah, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that if you look at the first tour, which is only about 22 pages, I think, you get a pretty good idea of it. But the really unusual thing about it, first of all, it's written in a way that I've never written before. It's written in a very informal way. It has contractions. It has jokes. It has a lot of jokes in it.
It's a fun way to write.
I haven't completely explained or even articulated to myself why I felt it was necessary to adopt this new way of writing and this new way of presenting things. And it's definitely because the debates are so heated and because they are wars. Really.
Right,
and for some reason, heights of passion get involved in these debates. And I wanted to try to find a way to have people try out this other perspective, a new perspective, and to go back and not just present the methods, the methodologies, along with the traditional philosophies that go with them. Because now we've already started to move things around. Not all Bayesians want to be subjectivists, for example.
Right.
And some of them don't even want to be probabilists. We have somebody by the name of Andrew Gelman at Columbia who's a statistician, and he wants to be a falsificationist and use severe tests. So things have gotten jumbled, which is making the debates very interesting, too. So we really need to go back and use a lot of courage, I think. I say we need chutzpah to go back and challenge some of the high priests and what they have said and what they have said Fisher really wanted and Naiman really said and so on, and take the responsibility for interpreting these methods anew.
Yeah. So if we were to accept a number of the claims here in this book, what are some of the key takeaways? What are some of the sort of the resulting consequences that for statisticians as well as scientists and philosophers?
Well, I also separately deal with trying to solve some philosophical problems that have been considered taboo, problems of induction and falsification and what makes science and demarcation of science. But I think for statisticians, for starters, to understand at least the nature of the disagreements. As far as particular methodologies, I have something called the farewell keepsake at the end. The book has souvenirs.
Mm-hmm.
And I give a review of the arguments, of all the central arguments that have been articulated against frequentist statistical tests and related methods, and how we respond to them. And so I honestly think that as idealistic as this is, that all future debates should start from this point. Because what we have now are hundreds, I really mean hundreds of articles over and over again, rehearsing verbatim the same exact criticism, let's say, of p-values as exaggerating the evidence or something like that. Well, we have answered those, and so don't just repeat them. Start from this point. I do make it clear that if you hold to a different view, a view that is not trying to use error probing capacities, then you really will come up with a different answer. And I actually say that I think that the goal of highly probed claims is sufficiently different from the goal of highly probable claims, however that's interpreted, that you can have both types of tools for different contexts. So I'm not a unificationist, actually. So that's a very big, thing, because the big move still is to try to unify, and I think that's a mistake. You should appreciate these different goals, but you should start with these arguments and stop repeatedly publishing the same papers with the same criticism.
Yeah, that's understandable. Well, hopefully this book will make it into the hands of philosophers of statistics, as well as those in the social scientists who are beginning to write methodology or conceptual papers on this issue. Folks who are reading, who are publishing in the replication crisis, reproducibility crisis, as well as those who write on statistical inferences and inference in general. Have you? Go ahead.
So.
Did you
because some of the reforms that these people are assuming that they have to accept come from different sides of the aisle, and really they shouldn't be just blithely accepting them. So, for example, we have Bayesian criticisms that have convinced many people that p-values are exaggerating, and so we need to lower them. And there's nothing wrong with lowering the requirement for p-values. I mean, I was
going to ask about that if you'd read that p as 0.005 paper, or had heard about that proposal.
So
Oh, go ahead.
Right. So that's a perfect example of it's not. Okay, so I would be opposed to setting these stringent, cutoffs, and actually so were Neyman and Pearson. Instead, we want to balance, the errors, and we want to look at the actual data. By the way, the severity account completely reformulates statistical tests and confidence intervals, so that we're not just rejecting and accepting claims. Instead, we're assessing how large the discrepancies are from some reference point or some null hypothesis.
And that's what had been missing so far, or had been previously missing.
Well,
exactly.
That's right. But it also improves on confidence intervals, which does give us an idea of the effect size, because for starters, instead of just choosing one confidence level, we actually have several different severity levels, so that the different points in a typical confidence interval said, well, these are all compatible. Well, they're compatible to different degrees, and the severity count completely indicates this. And also, it gives this inferential construal of confidence intervals, which are now only justified by their long-run coverage probability. If you use this method in the long run, you will cover the true value. But with any particular case, you're unable to say that either probably these values, are true, or these values are plausible, or anything like that. So it's missing this epistemological interpretation.
Yeah.
So I provide that.
Fantastic. All right. So I imagine, in this summer seminar, will the book be one of the main focuses, or will this be kind of covering additional projects or themes?
Well, the interesting thing, as we're finding out as we begin this course, we're offering this summer seminar for people who don't have a statistics background, and Aristotle is really ideally positioned to find that. He was the person who, I met him here in 1999. We didn't even know that we were here. And he had gone to the LSE, and he really explained these concepts in probability and statistics in a much clearer way than I had ever seen. So, in short, we're going to need to do a lot more background for the first several days in order that people who don't already know a certain amount of statistics can get this understanding. And then we will try to talk about some of the main philosophy of statistics wars and problems using that knowledge. So we need to develop this so that it can work.
Fantastic. And well, it sounds like a very exciting project, and hopefully it will get. Hopefully, it will be. I imagine is this the inaugural summer session, or is this the first one you'll be hosting?
Yes, it is the first one.
Okay.
But I'm wondering, can I go back to something that?
Yeah, of course.
Lost the thread a little bit. Just a minute ago, you were asking me about that lowering the p-value, 0.005. Yeah. When I said that this is a perfect example of where the supposed need to do that comes from a group who are imposing a certain Bayesian analysis to the p-value, which is really funny because they're looking at an account that is not trying to give a posterior. But when we have people like in the open science group, Nozek and others who signed on because it seems like a good idea, we're going to make it more stringent, and that's perfectly fine, but it matters why. The reasoning matters. If you're going to look at Bayes factors to tell you what frequentist method to use, you may be surprised to learn that using the Bayes factor is actually exaggerating things more in terms of giving a high posterior probability to hypothesis that you wouldn't dream of saying is warranted based on the significance level. I point that out. I mean, that I show in detail through the book. So, I mean, what really, it kind of alarms me that people who are working in this area wouldn't really pursue the basis for the arguments, and the fact that the field has gotten so confused that it can seem very natural to just take something from a very different account and apply it and say, okay, you're doing things wrong. You have to match my numbers. You have to have your p-value matching my posterior probability of the null hypothesis. And yet, this argument goes way, way back to Edwards, Lindman, and Savage from the 1960s. So we can actually get a handle on all the debates for 70 or 80, 90 years, just looking at a handful of articles. And that current day people who are actually coming up with these reforms should know the basis and shouldn't just say, well, it sounds good, and these are smart people who are advising me. That was the last thing I wanted to say.
Fantastic. So it sounds to me like a lot of, you're doing a lot of confusion clearing up, and that a lot of these debates, I mean, it seems that there's a lot of misunderstanding of particular positions, and or maybe also just unaware, an ignorance or not familiarity with the sort of the ways in which these debates have played out over several decades.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my mission. Yeah. Thank you for listening, Bill.
Of course. No, this is fascinating. This is interesting. And as someone who has gone through a year's worth of statistical training in social science, and who certainly was instructed by someone who was definitely strongly leaning as a Bayesian, probably subjective Bayesian, and that's learning these, how to think about these things it's very fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to diving further into your book and kind of learning and figuring out how we can think about these issues, and then what that further means in terms of, I guess, like the structure of knowledge in science. So is there anything maybe you could say about that in terms of, if we're thinking about statistics and what it means for statistics, but what does it mean? What do, understanding this way of coming about, finding evidence for things and making claims and accepting things, what does this mean for just science, for science in general?
Well, I do think it's absolutely general, and in fact, severity also applies totally qualitatively, and my strongest arguments really are very qualitative. In that first tour, you'll see my example of how I infer that I've gained weight when a bunch of different well-calibrated scales all read, at least 4 pounds after I've returned from England, when I know these scales are reliable because they perfectly well weigh the weight of error and the growth of experimental knowledge, which is exactly 1 pound. And so we build together this kind of argument from coincidence, we might call it, an argument for the absence of an error. If you have a method, usually a set of tools together, that with high probability at least one of them would have shown the error, but none of them do. And unless we suppose that the instruments are somehow reading my mind just when I don't know the weight of something. This is really the basis for my solution to the problem of induction, by the way. But this idea about learning, literally learning from error, building up a baggage, a repertoire of mistakes in a field, and instead of kind of hiding them, a lot of these problem cases should proudly report how they found certain measurements, let's say in psychology or someplace, really aren't measuring what we thought, that this is really the most constructive way to become better learners. And, in this connection, it's been quite interesting to me that some of the biggest interests that I hadn't really anticipated in my new book comes from people in artificial intelligence and machine learning, because they're saying that they're using methods that they have no idea about their error probing abilities. And they, too, feel that what really matters is not how probable a claim is, but whether it's been well probed. So I absolutely think that it has general implications for science. And in the book, I have this chapter, before I introduce statistical tests, I talk about sexy science, because somebody once said to me, oh, well, you're talking about sexy science, like the general relativity testing the eclipse. And I was kind of taken aback, because they don't realize that it's actually very, very similar, that we have these connections between statistical and substantive models, and we do a lot of the same kinds of error probes in fields in general. So I really do think that it gives a different conception to scientific learning and different philosophies of science that would focus more on those, tools of the trade, these low-level, you could call them, strategies, starting from the data, starting from problems, and building up theories, instead of supposing we start with models and theories and try to test them. It's very much of a grounds-up conception.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the excellent explanation and introduction to the book, and a little bit more about what its implications are. I really appreciate that.
I hope you'll be at the lecture, possibly.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, of course. Well, before we go, why don't we actually turn to the last question I like to ask of the philosophers of science, which is a more general disciplinary question. What do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Well, I think that one of the big challenges is how to be relevant to practice. We still have philosophers of science being considered irrelevant, maybe even a little bit more so nowadays, I hear from the physicists. And this, I think, is ridiculous and takes us back to where we began when I mentioned that American Statistical Association powwow, as I call it, where they were trying to work through their conceptual, really, difficulties, trying to put them down on paper, trying to write them out into a bunch of principles. And philosophers really could have helped quite a bit in keeping these notions clear. So it's because I think that one of the biggest challenges facing philosophers of science is to be relevant, that I am developing this workshop. Because as much as you want to be relevant and you can work and immerse yourself with scientists, there's a little bit of an obstacle when it comes to some of these more formal ideas. And, of course, philosophers have always worked on formal things, And there's no reason, in my opinion, that some of our classes in philosophy, science, and logic wouldn't include, let's say, statistical tests and basic notions.
Sure.
I know many philosophers of science working on causal modeling for a long time, and they're fantastic in doing these formal things. So we're trying to encourage that, and the projects that we hope people will do is precisely to incorporate these ideas in their research and their teaching. To do that, because really whole fields, whole areas of methodology and foundations could be built together with philosophy departments. For example, one of the hottest topics is ethics in data science.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
Well, actually, I thought you were going to say something like machine learning, things like that. But I mean, that could be kind of connected. Having recently seen there's a postdoc up currently that involves bringing together computer scientists, social scientists, and philosophers to work on like the AI, like ethics of AI and things like that.
Where's that?
That's at Australian National University. And so, it's a pretty recent posting. But definitely seems like a very cool endeavor that has this team-based science or team-based philosophy of science approach to getting people together. So
I'm really glad they're including philosophers, and I don't know if we have a lot of that going on or any of that going on in this country. I heard of a course yesterday here on ethics and data analysis or something like that. And but it's not going to be incorporating philosophers. So this is another example of where philosophers really need to understand the more formal issues. And this has actually always been true of the field of ethics in research, ethics in business. These are old fields, but I have often been involved in them, and I have also seen that if you don't know some of the formal parts, especially the statistics, you can wind up sort of rooting for the wrong side, or even weakening your opinion. You might think, well, I have to appeal to a precautionary principle or something because the evidence isn't there for a particular case of a risk. But in fact, the evidence is there if you interpret them correctly. And so I've often been in this odd position of saying, you really have a much stronger account if you would want it. So I worry that a lot of these big things on ethics in STEM and ethics in AI are not including philosophers of science. So I hope they will, but when they do, it's going to be important for the philosophers to understand all the dimensions.
Yeah.
One of them is going to be the formal stuff, and I'm sure some of them are doing it. I had a special lunch at the Philosophy of Science Association meeting recently in Seattle, and it was on this Philstat ideas. And I got all of these people, it was going to be just 10 people or something, and people kept writing to me saying, I'd like to come, and I already had too many. So it's clear that there's a lot of interest, and I want to help develop that, because, as I say, with all of the new reforms, and by the way, we didn't mention the new meta research and meta science teams and departments that have suddenly shot up in places like Stanford and Berkeley and so on. They do not include philosophers. I was invited to one of these meta-research things recently, and there were 2 philosophers there, but we're not really involved in those great, big, usually funded meta-science programs, and I think we should be.
Yeah, like metrics at Stanford, I'm seeing, yeah.
If you think of the combination of the ethics side and the conceptual side and the modeling side and the statistics side, which I want to develop, we could almost be, a department for that, for improving methodology, where people would be sent to go improve their skills and their ability to argue and their ability to communicate uncertainties.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. I wasn't super familiar with the meta science aspect, but it seems like, this is sort of like sort of science of science. I've heard described, and I've certainly heard philosophers of science do science of science. I think like Paul Thagard, or there's a few other folks who have started people who do science studies. But you're right in terms of the actual departments or initiatives. I'm not familiar with those, but that's a shame that these particular initiatives at least are not initially connected with either being.
That's right. There is somewhat of a difference in the use, but you're right that with STS and even back with Larry Loudon, there was this idea of studying how to do better science and sociology of science. But the new departments and new fundings, and there's these huge foundations, are primarily to try to improve methodology as a direct result of the replication crisis. To get better open science, to figure out how to change the so-called perverse incentives that some people argue drive scientists to cheat and to p-hack and data dredge because they won't publish otherwise. And there's a whole area about what should we be doing. Should we be giving badges, and then there's a whole separate area of study about what's causally most efficacious in improving behavior, I have some criticism of this, but So I was surprised when those things opened up just a few years ago that they didn't involve philosophers.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly something, perhaps this would be something to write about, either through public outreach or comment on particular, and sort of like what could be the role of philosophers of science in these particular initiatives, and has that been considered? And hopefully we're starting to see, like kind of like with this ethics approach, some team-based approaches that do include philosophers. I think there's one at Rohr University that looks at memory research, for example, that definitely includes philosophers of science on that. But in terms of meta-science, it's still up in the air. So hopefully we'll see something different in the future.
Oh, I suppose I should mention at least once that this new field in philosophy of experimental philosophy, which is trying to do philosophy but experimentally. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, X-Fi and things like that. Yeah, I've been familiar. Yeah,
it's still relatively new, but the irony about the whole thing is that they're involved in some of the problematic cases that psychologists are involved in. And I keep thinking, well, the philosophers of science are the ones that ought to be critiquing a lot of these studies in psychology and also now in experimental philosophy. But in the conferences I've been to, I've been really disappointed. They're doing really interesting work, but you don't see a critique of the methods. I mean, maybe they are still at the phase of developing them, and they're so excited about developing them. There has been work on replication rates, which I don't really think is such a great way to assess the field, and that they're not doing too badly in that. But I really think that they should mesh with the scientists in psychology who are working on methodology.
Yeah, I hope so. And we're seeing there are a few philosophers of science who may. I can think like Edouard Mastry, for example, is somebody who is...
he's the name that comes up, and he's one of few. And he
very few, that's right.
About this idea that philosophers of science, or in general, need to learn the statistics. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
He was at that conference, at one of the ones I mentioned, at UCL last summer. So a lot of exciting work being done, and I look forward to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Deborah, so much for being willing to chat and share more about your work. And it's been great to learn about everything that's been going on. Thank you once again. Enjoy the day, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.